At 4:17 in the morning, on August 24th, 1857, a single handwritten note crossed Wall Street and quietly prevented the collapse of the American economy. The note went from Edwin Ludlow, the New York branch manager of the Ohio Life Insurance and Trust Company, to Moses Taylor at Citibank, requesting an emergency credit line of $2 million before the doors opened. Ludlow knew what no one else yet did. The Cincinnati office was insolvent. The books were rotten with embezzlement his own name was tied to, and a depositor run that morning would cascade through every overextended railroad bond and western land speculation in the country. In this alternate timeline exploration, we examine what could have happened and why the real history unfolded differently. Taylor, the wealthiest merchant in the city and a man who hated public crisis more than private loss, signed the note before sunrise. By 9 o'clock, the run that should have started never began. By Friday, the Cincinnati office was being quietly restructured under Citibank's supervision. There were rumors on the curb that week, but rumors die when there are no closed doors to look at. The Panic of 1857 had been written into the ledger and then crossed out before anyone read it. But what no one understood at the time, what would not become clear for almost a generation, was that Taylor's signature had bought far more than a bank. With the credit markets steady, the autumn of 1857 passed without the wave of bankruptcies that should have swept through the Erie Railroad, the Illinois Central, and the dry goods houses of Lower Manhattan. Construction crews kept laying track through the Alleghenies. Factories in Lowell and Paterson held their workforces and added to them through the winter. James Buchanan, inaugurated only 6 months earlier, found himself presiding over a country that did not need him to do anything heroic. Freed from the firefighting that history would have demanded of him, his administration spent its political capital differently. When the Lecompton Constitution arrived from Kansas in early 1858, Buchanan brokered rather than bullied. He let Stephen Douglas write the compromise language himself, accepting a referendum that delayed Kansas statehood by 2 years and kept the Democratic Party from splitting along the line that in another timeline would have ended it. The newspapers called it ordinary politics. That was the highest compliment the decade would offer. In Liverpool, middling cotton held near 11 cents a pound through 1858 and 1859, and the British mills ran without a stutter. Southern planters, flush with returns and unshaken by any northern banking shock, reinvested at a scale the region had never seen. Land prices in the Mississippi Delta climbed steadily. The slave markets in New Orleans and Charleston posted record prices, a fact that should not be softened by anything else that follows in this story. But the same money also moved into steam-powered cotton gins, into snag clearing on the Tombigbee and the Yazoo, and into a small but real wave of textile mills around Augusta, Columbus, and Graniteville. William Gregg's experiment in South Carolina, which in our history remained a curiosity, began to be copied. The institution of slavery was not weakening, it was being industrialized. Without a depression to sharpen every grievance, the Democratic Party arrived at Charleston in the spring of 1860 angry but still whole. Stephen Douglas took the nomination on the third ballot, popular sovereignty intact, the Southern delegations grumbling but seated. In Chicago, the Republicans nominated William Seward, the senior man, the expected man, and a candidate whose national stature did not have to be invented in a hurry. Abraham Lincoln, having lost his 1858 Senate race to Douglas without the financial crash that had elevated Republican rhetoric, was a respected Illinois lawyer with a strong regional following and no particular path beyond it. The general election was close. Douglas carried Pennsylvania and Indiana by narrow margins and won the presidency without the four-way fracture that had broken the country in our history. Lincoln returned to his Springfield practice. He would write a friend that winter that he was relieved, and there is no reason to doubt him. Douglas governed the way he had legislated by trading. His Transcontinental Railroad Bill, signed in 1862, ran 2 trunk lines west, one through Omaha and one through Memphis and El Paso, with federal land grants distributed carefully enough that no faction left the room empty-handed. He enforced the Fugitive Slave Act in the border states and quietly let it lapse in New England, where federal marshals found themselves without local cooperation and were not pressed to find any. On the territorial question, he held his line. Arizona and the Pacific holdings would enter free by popular vote, and the votes were arranged. Southern firebrands called him a traitor in the columns of the Charleston Mercury. Douglas had survived being called a traitor before. The consequences of holding the country together this way would prove enormous, but those consequences would not arrive on his watch. Through the 1860s, American industrial output more than doubled. Bessemer converters opened in Pittsburgh in 1864, in Cleveland the year after, and, more quietly but no less seriously, in Birmingham, Alabama, where Northern Capital and Southern Coal met in a partnership that neither side fully trusted. Track mileage passed 60,000. The Federal Arsenal at Springfield retooled for breech-loading rifles. The Tredegar Iron Works in Richmond, no longer starved for capital, began casting rifled artillery on contract for state militias both north and south. Every state guard in the country drilled with weapons that, only a decade earlier, had not existed. The men who would later lead armies, Sherman teaching at the Louisiana State Seminary, Longstreet on quiet garrison duty, Hancock at a Pacific outpost, grew older, and the weapons they would one day command grew far more lethal. The compromise held until it could no longer. In 1868, Colorado entered the Union as a free state, tipping the Senate by one vote, and a younger generation of Southern fire-eaters who had grown rich rather than desperate decided that the Douglas bargain had been a slow surrender all along. Robert Toombs and the new men around him, Wade Hampton's protégés in Carolina and the cotton mill heirs of Georgia, ran the planter conventions of 1869 and 1870 on a single argument. The numbers were moving against them and would not stop. In the 1870 midterms, the Republicans, now led nationally by Salmon Chase of Ohio, took both houses of Congress. Chase announced for the presidency the following spring, and then came the moment that would define everything that followed. South Carolina seceded in March 1873, 4 months after Chase's inauguration. Mississippi, Alabama, and Georgia followed within 6 weeks. The war that opened that summer was not the War of 1861. Both sides moved divisions by rail in days rather than weeks. Both sides fielded breech-loading infantry and rifled batteries that could reach 2 miles. The first major engagement, fought outside Chattanooga in August, killed more men in a single afternoon than Shiloh had in 2 days. By the end of 1874, the casualty lists exceeded anything the Republic had imagined, and the cotton districts that had financed the rebellion were being systematically burned by Union columns moving on iron wheels. The war ended in the spring of 1876 with Confederate surrender at Selma and a reconstruction that the bloodier fighting made harsher than the one history actually delivered. The slow road, in the end, had not been the kinder one. It had only been the longer one, and the country that walked it arrived at the same place with more graves to dig.